So hello everyone, welcome to VizConnect, connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. My name is Sagar Kapoor. I'm part of customer success team at Tableau. So VizConnect is your weekly Tableau community call, which inspires you, motivate you to participate in Tableau community events, learn from our Tableau Zen Master, Tableau champions, Tableau public featured author to go ahead and upskill your skills in Tableau. We have our YouTube channel. So all the sessions which are presented in VizConnect are uploaded to our YouTube channel. Go ahead, subscribe to it. Some great content waiting for you. We have a LinkedIn group. So all the information, best practices with respect to data visualization and storytelling are posted to our group. Just go ahead and be a member of this particular group. Also, Tableau Conference 2021 is announced. It will be on 9 to 11th. I think registration will open in 3 or 4 days. Just go ahead and register and can't wait to see you in the conference. With that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. His name is David. So David is a senior clinical data analyst at Alchemus in Boston. He recently graduated in 2019 with his Master's of Science in Health Informatics and has been working with Tableau for around 3.5 years. He's passionate about data visualization and also has a small obsession with design and user experience. In his free time, David loves to play board games, cook, and play badminton with his fiance. So without further ado, David, over to you to talk about the analyst guide for user experience.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone on the VizConnect team. I'm so excited to be finally presenting something about user experience to everyone. And without further ado, the presentation, the Analyst Guide to User Experience. See if I can advance my slide. Okay, so just a little bit about me. My name is David Borczuk. I'm a senior clinical data analyst at a pharmaceutical company. I am currently a Tableau public ambassador, a featured author, and I've been featured on Tableau's Viz of the Day around 6 times. Picture on the right, recently got engaged to my beautiful fiance, Vanessa, and life's been great ever since. So I have a pretty consistent presence on Tableau Public. I like to create long form visualizations. As you can see, these are a few of my examples that I've done throughout my entire Tableau Public career. And I really want to make sure that I adhere by certain design standards that I want to showcase in my work. All the visualizations that I provide is not just an example of the data, but how to present data in a certain way. And so I kind of want to show you the behind the scenes processes in my head that I think about, and then how you can engineer the same type of workflow at your job. So the agenda for today, we have 3 parts. Part 1, we're going to go over some UX, and UX stands for user experience, definitions and principles. What is user experience and how can it make an impact at your workplace? And then we also have part 2, UX practices. What are some of the important UX methodologies that you can use at your work to improve your workflow? And then finally, we're going to learn something about heuristic evaluation. How can you use this method in order to iterate and improve your designs? So before we start anything, we have to have a formal definition of user experience in the Norman Nielsen group, which is kind of, Norman Nielsen's one of the pioneers of user experience. He defines it as encompassing all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. So sometimes when people think of user experience, it's about, you know, the human computer interaction that they have with a certain application or with a certain product, but it's the entire experience that the user has with the company. And an example is Apple, when they created the iPhone, they charged the iPhone prior to you receiving the iPhone so that you can have a full charge when you start using the iPhone. That has nothing really to do with the experience of the iPhone, but when you actually get the iPhone, you don't have to worry about charging it or anything. You have it there for you to go. And so that's an example of a user experience that happens outside of the product. And I feel like that's really important to make sure that we understand. So whenever I think of user experience, the first example that I give is a kettle. And this is kind of a ubiquitous user experience example that people like to give. So when you use a kettle, the user goal is to boil water. And the kettle does a really good job at doing this. You remove this gigantic lid on the kettle. It has a huge handle for you to hold and pour water from. You fill the kettle with water and you turn on the flame, and it's in a closed system. And so it boils faster and you're able to go somewhere else. There's a really special part about the kettle is that just-in-time notification that you get when the water is boiling. You don't have to worry about the kettle at all until it makes a sound. And it's something that has been used for a really long time. In Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, the kettle was actually used by doctors for medicinal purposes. They can prepare their medicines with boiling water. And whenever I like to think of user experiences and disruptive innovations, something I learned in grad school is to talk about something called the timeless human truth. What is our instinctual benefit that we get from a product? And in this case, the doctor is able to prepare medicine. This is not a quote. I made a quote for a doctor at that time. I can now prepare medicine and maximize the care of my patient at the same time, knowing exactly when the water will be ready. So instead of the doctor having to just sit at the pot and wait for the boiling water while the patient might need extra care, the doctor is now able to divide his or her time beneficially. And so the kettle is a tool that helps accomplish that. And it was a major user experience marvel that happened in the early days, and it's still used today, which is pretty incredible. Another example I like to give about user experience is this microwave example. What takes less time? Heating water in the microwave for 1 minute and 10 seconds, or heating water in the microwave for 1 minute and 11 seconds? And so when you think of 1 minute and 10 seconds, from the microwave's point of view, 1 minute and 10 seconds is less time. But you have to add on the fact that the user has to select one twice, find the 0 key on that little numpad, move your hand to the 0 key, and press it. And that takes some extra time. It might actually take longer than 1 minute and 10 seconds for that whole interaction to occur. Meanwhile, if you heat up water in a microwave for 1 minute and 11 seconds, 1 minute and 11 seconds is more time for the microwave. But from the user's point of view, all you have to do is find the 1 key and hit the 1 key 3 times and you're done. And so it's really important to understand that there's two sides to this coin. You have the microwaves and the machine's point of view that's executing a certain job. But then you also have to understand that the user is executing a job that might take longer and make the whole process longer overall. And so understanding the human-computer interaction component is really, really important when considering user experience. And so you have to consider the user when building a product, or they're going to abandon your product. And this is really important when building a dashboard for a certain audience. The dashboard has to be efficient, but you have to make sure that the user is generating an efficient job on their end as well. So if they get too frustrated with your tool, they might abandon your product. And this is something called decision fatigue. And decision fatigue is the idea where you have so many decisions that you need to make, or you're dealing with a complicated task that's challenging your cognitive load, you eventually give up on that task. And this was observed in a parole hearings study where basically officers gave favorable outcomes to inmates based on the ordinal position of that inmate throughout the day. In other words, the first inmate, the officers were able to go through their story, understand, how they reformed, and maybe they had a favorable outcome, decrease the amount of time that they were on parole or decrease the amount of time they were in jail. However, as time went on, the outcomes got less and less favorable because over time, the parole officers had to make more and more complicated decisions, and they just got tired of it. They reached decision fatigue. And so this graph shows the odds of receiving a favorable outcome over time, well, not over time, based on the ordinal position of the inmate. So as you go from left to right, that's the next inmate in the line. And as you see, these dotted lines here with the circles on top are whenever the parole officers had a break. So eating food or resting your head or taking a nap, whatever they do to rest would at first help them make more informed decisions or recharge. But you can see that it's the odds kind of drastically decreased after every subsequent break. So basically, you got lucky if you were at the beginning of the line to get a parole discussion, but it's really important to understand this concept and how it's in our lives every day. This is just an example. You can also say that if you're on a website and there's a certain period of time that you're trying to figure out where something is, you might just close the website because you're tired of having to deal with it. And this is really important. And we'll get into ways of decreasing that phenomenon as well. So usability is composed of 5 central ideas. I call it the 5 commandments: learnability, efficiency, memorability, errors, and satisfaction. So for learnability, how easy can the user accomplish tasks when they first use the design? And so how quickly, if we translate all of this to like dashboards and visualizations, how quickly can the user understand what to do with the dashboard when they first open up that app on the server or on Tableau Public? And then efficiency, once the design is learned, how quickly can the user perform tasks? So not only how quickly can your user understand what to do, but how well is your dashboard engineered so that they can maximize its function as quickly as possible? And then third, memorability. How well can users remember how to use the design when returning to it? This is really important. How well does your dashboard allow users to recall information so that when they return to the dashboard, they don't have to relearn any of the processes? They know they can pick it up immediately and understand how to answer the questions that they're looking for. Another really important one, errors. How many errors does the user make using the design, and how severe can these errors be? And do you give a way for the user to recover from these errors? Is there a reset function for your filters? Are you able to kind of guide the user towards reverting to a home page or reverting to a previous action that they've made? And then finally, satisfaction. How pleasant is the design, and how well can the experience of the user be quantified, and how nice does the user feel when using your tool? And that's also really, really important and generates loyalty towards your product. And I'll go into that later as well. So that's a lot to consider. So let's start with learning some basic principles of user experience so that you can kind of take that and jump on to the next step, practicing user experience methodologies at your job. So the most important one that I like to go over is the Doherty threshold. And this states that productivity soars when a computer and its users interact at a pace of less than 400 milliseconds that ensures that neither has to wait on the other. So this is kind of a two-sided coin. On one hand, you need to make sure that the dashboard that you're creating and the visualizations that you're creating are easy to understand so that the user knows what to do and the user is able to go from step 1 to step 2 really easily. But you also need to make sure the dashboard itself runs well. And this requires that you certify your data, clean your data, optimize your data, optimize all the calculations in Tableau, and make sure that everything is running well. Because studies have shown that if it takes longer than 400 milliseconds for a user to interact with something, or even a dashboard to load, the chances are that they're going to have lesser satisfaction in the tool than you're expecting them to. The second law of UX is called Fit's law. The time to acquire a target is a function of the distance to and the size of the target. So the example I have on the right is you have a cursor in the center and you have different size circles. The bigger circle that's closer, it's going to be easier to interact with than the small circle all the way on the left-hand side. And this is basically, how easily clickable is something, I guess, to put in layman's terms. The smaller an object is and the further away the object is from the cursor, the harder it is to press. And so when you create call to action buttons or you create visualizations that require user input, you want to make sure that they're big and they're close to the starting point of where a user would be. And generally a user will start at the top left-hand side of the dashboard and navigate left to right in a Z pattern. And so that's just something to consider when building out certain dashboards with certain elements that you need the user to click on. The third law of UX is Hick's law. The time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. And so I like to kind of compare this to a board game. The one that you see here is called Twilight Imperium, which is, I feel like, one of the more complicated board games you can put on a table. And in this case, there's so many decisions that you can make, and it's just a very intimidating setup for a board game that you might look at all of the decisions that you have to make per turn, and you just, again, reach this decision fatigue and make either a choice that's not optimal, or you want to make a choice that is just like giving up and like throwing the table and just leaving, your friend's house where you're having this board game. And I think that's important when building your dashboards. You don't want to make it so that the user has to consider a lot of different possibilities in order to generate an outcome. You want to really limit those end user interactions and guide the user with simplistic workflows so that they can answer one or two questions at a time. The fourth law of provenance. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but people will perceive and interpret an ambiguous or complex images as the simplest form possible because it is the interpretation that requires the least cognitive effort for us. So the example on the right here, we have a lion on the left side of the picture, but then if you flip the lion picture over, it looks kind of like a mouse that's scared running at you. And this is because our brain kind of manifests its own version of images that are the simplistic form. And the reason why I put this in this presentation is because sometimes I feel like complex chart types can have this effect too. If you create something that's overly complicated and has many moving parts, when someone looks at this chart, they might interpret it as being something different than how you wanted them to interpret it. Sometimes I see these massive chord diagrams that people create, or different like sunburst diagrams, and it's really beautiful to look at. But when you try to decode what's actually going on, you might see it in some shape where another person sees it in a different shape. And so you have to make sure that you're creating a very succinct and simplistic version of that if you can. And finally, Jacob's law. Users spend most of their time on other websites. This is just framed in a websites, but you can think of it as visualizations or dashboards. This means that users prefer your site to work the same way as all other sites they already know. So on the picture on the right shows a navigation bar for really popular websites. And as you can see, there's a logo on the left, a search bar in the middle, your user account on the right, and then your cart. And this is really important because when a user goes on a particular website or it goes on a particular dashboard, they expect that certain elements are going to be conserved across these different user experiences and interfaces. And so if you build a dashboard that challenges this convention, it's going to harm your user experience. And so at least when you're at work and you're creating a dashboard, have the users stick with one type of format where they're expecting a certain element to be at a certain part of the dashboard, and keep that consistent. The minute you change it, they have to, encode where things are, and that might take extra time. Then the Darty threshold is going to be challenged, and the user might have that decision fatigue effect, and everything kind of crumbles once that happens. So just something to keep in mind. So that was 5 core principles I wanted you to understand before we get to the next part. The takeaways from this part is that user experience isn't avoidable. It's literally part of our psychology, and it's not always intuitive. You have to always consider the human portion of user experience and the computer portion of experience in order to maximize the time that it takes for a user to interact with your tool and product. And then finally, understanding the basic laws and principles of user experience will serve as a foundation for implementing these changes. So we got through the first part. That was quick. Now we want to do kind of the meat of this presentation, which is the UX practices. You learn these definitions, but what are some ways you can actually implement a user experience stack at your job? So before we go anywhere, we have to kind of describe the cycles that involve user experience. And so design thinking is a cyclical lifestyle, and iteration is really important. Again, this is from the Norman Nielsen group. Most of my information from this presentation is from that website if you're interested in looking at it in more detail. But it starts with empathizing with your end users and then working towards defining your research, and then once you have all of those steps together, you start ideating and brainstorming, you prototype your design, you test your design, and you finally implement. And then you go through a second cycle of that where you re-empathize with your end users and so on. And so if you see on the outer ring, the three core sections is understanding, exploring, and materializing. And that's kind of how I, at my job, build out the visualizations and dashboards that I want to create. You have those three core sections. So it's not only cyclical, user experience also has layers to it. And this is a example from Jesse James Garrett, who is a famous designer. He posted this diagram that shows the elements of user experience. I don't want you to look at any of the text. I just want you to look at the thing in the center. Basically, there are 5 layers to user experience, where it starts at the user needs and the site objectives. And then as become more concrete, you get content requirements and functional specifications. You develop an information architecture, and then you have your information and design and navigation design. And then finally, your visual design. And when you're at the bottom, the ideas are abstract because you're kind of developing the thoughts and business requirements of your visualization. But as you start to get towards visual design, that's actually concrete information. You are literally putting visual elements on a interface. And also, as you go up towards the top, you're starting from conception to completion. And so you're dealing with a cyclical pattern, but you're also dealing with a layered workflow. And so just something to also consider, there's different layers here that you need to work with, and each layer is essential in order to maximize the user experience and design of what you're building. So that's a lot. And how do we take all of that and actually inject it in our analyst job? So the first step is we want to empathize, and there's 4 main components that I want to talk about here. The first is to conduct stakeholder interviews, and I'm sure a lot of you already do this who are building dashboards for clients or people at your job. So this will help you kind of gather those business requirements and figure out what the user is interested in and what type of designs they're interested in. That's 100%, you need to do that in order to actually build what you need to build. The second one is determining the UX metrics. How are you going to measure how usable your dashboard is? I remember going to the Tableau conference a couple of years ago, and a little booth had like a set of glasses that like allowed you to look at a certain dashboard, and it outputted a heat map based on where you're looking, so an eye tracker tool. Not everyone has that, but that's an example of how you test user experience. You can see how long it takes for a user to accomplish a task. You basically want to find a way to quantify how effective your dashboard is, and figuring out those metrics is another part of empathizing with the end user. Then the third one is scouting data sources. Again, a lot of us do this already, but make sure that your data is certifiable and verified and clean, and everything is kind of squeaky, to make sure that that Darty threshold on the computer side is maximized. And if it's not, then you're going to have to worry about, as much as your user experience is refined on the user end, if your dashboard takes a long time to load due to unoptimized data behind it, the user is going to suffer innately because of that. And then finally, you want to talk with experts. See if there's subject matter experts with the data that you're working with, or with user experience, or with the business requirements that you're dealing with, that are different from your stakeholders, that might provide a valuable set of information for you in order to develop your dashboard differently or set up calculations differently. That will kind of increase the amount of time that decrease the amount of time that calculations are working behind the scenes, or decreasing the amount of necessary user input that you need to have in order to generate an output from your dashboard. So what I use a lot in my job is something called an empathy map. When I'm doing a dashboard and I'm kind of conceptualizing what I really think is important, I create this, and an empathy map has like the user in the center, and it has 4 quadrants to it. One that says, what is the user saying? What is the user thinking? What is the user feeling? And what is the user doing? And you can create this while you're testing the product or before you actually build your dashboard. And so I think that's really important, because it captures all the different elements that a user is going to be exhibiting when building a product, when using your product. So you can anticipate what the user might be saying when they're interacting with your dashboard, what type of thoughts they're having, how they're feeling. Are they feeling frustrated, or they're feeling stressed when using your dashboard, or happy? And then how are they actually interacting with your dashboard? Are they clicking the right things and stuff like that? So I build that before I do the dashboard, and then I make the dashboard through all the steps that we'll go over later. And then I test this hypothesis at the end and see if it matches. So after you do all that, this is really kind of where most of the work happens, the ideation process. The first one is you want to brainstorm as much as possible. There's no good or bad idea. A good idea or bad idea is all a function of your thoughts and how you're perceiving your product. You want to make sure that the ideas that the end user has are the ideas that you're generating. And so an idea that you might not think is right might actually be the perfect fit for the end user with your dashboard. And so you want to get as many ideas down on paper as you can. And then you will kind of parse those ideas out as you're building your dashboard and building prototypes for it. The second one that's really important is creating persona profiles. And this is basically fake user profiles that anticipate the average user or average users of your dashboard. And you want to make it as specific as possible in order to really, really cater towards the user that you're trying to appease or you're trying to build a dashboard for or a product for. And I'll give an example later. Additionally, creating user journey maps is something that will help augment the persona profiles, which is basically you are creating a series of activities that the user is doing, and you're kind of quantifying their mood throughout that process, so you can kind of figure out where there are hurdles in their journey while using the app or using the dashboard, and you can kind of optimize certain steps that they take. Again, I'll give you an example in a bit. And then finally, card sorting is a UX research method that basically allows people to sit in a room and you have a bunch of different topics that are spread out in cards on a table, and they take these cards and organize them into specific groups. And that really helps you generate an information architecture that you might not have expected. And I'll have an example for that as well. So let's start brainstorming. And the one that I like to use in a perfect environment is Disney's creative strategy. As we know, Disney World's amazing. That's my opinion, but I really think it's a really amazing design and logistical feat. And so I really want to emulate Walt Disney's style of building out different ideas. So he said that there should be 3 roles within your discussion groups. One is a dreamer, and this is someone who has no restrictions or criticisms of ideas. The visionary, like Walt Disney would be a dreamer. He's someone who has a bunch of these awesome ideas that might not be feasible or would be feasible, and you need someone to have that to generate as many, thoughts that you can. Then you have a realist who takes the ideas of the dreamer and thinks about how it can be implemented logistically in order for the product or the idea to materialize. What's the action plan for this? What is the timeline for this project? And so that's what the realist does. Then you have the critic who takes the ideas of the realist and sees if those action plans are feasible or if they're barriers to the action plan or if it's just not going to work. So you're having the dreamer create all the ideas. You have the doer who kind of generates the realistic action plan for the ideas of the dreamer. And then you have the critic who challenges, honestly, the dreamer or the realist, but mostly the ideas of the realist. So it's a cycle where the dreamer is creating ideas and it's being challenged by the realist and critic, and you kind of go over these ideas. So in your work, you can kind of designate who is a visionary type of person, who is someone who likes to do logistical challenges, and who's someone who likes to play devil's advocate, or who likes to kind of figure out the nitty-gritty of whether the logistical challenges will work within budget or will work within the timeline that you're trying to, create. So once you do that, and you've figured out all of your brainstorming ideas and you have everything down on paper, you want to start kind of developing your average persona. And I actually created this persona while working on this presentation. We have Josh, who's an IT manager at a company who wants to use Tableau to keep track of an IT ticketing system. And as you can see, I made many different components of Josh's repertoire. I figured out what his skills are, his needs, the values that he has of his job, his work responsibilities, and his personality even. And as the more specific you're able to nail this, the better you're going to anticipate what the end users are. You can actually use an end user as an example of a persona profile to generate kind of like an average end user that you're trying to create. Maybe your audience is a CEO. So create a CEO profile. What is this person's schedule like? What does this person value in the company? What are their goals? What are their aspirations? If you can channel this, you can build an app that literally connects to the different facets of a person's being. And that seems really philosophical, but all of this stuff starts to click when you actually achieve that, and all of the things that they're expecting in your product is realized because you've anticipated all of these different facets. So when you build a persona profile, you have a section where you have like a fake person's picture. I feel like that's really important to kind of get a name to a picture, even though this is a fake UI. There's a site called UI Faces that you can get these pictures for free. It's royalty free, so you can generate this. Get some skills, values, needs, work responsibilities, and personalities of this person on a paper, and do this for a few people, and you'll generate a series of personas that will be using your application. Then you want to create something called a journey map. And the journey map is composed of 5 sections: awareness, consideration, decision, service, and loyalty. And I'm not going to go over all the little details on here. You'll be able to access that in the recording. But basically, the awareness section is, this guy gets an email from his IT manager person that there needs to be a graph that needs to be created in Excel. And this journey map outlines his consideration of Tableau as the tool and goes through all the different processes that he goes in his head in order to finally use Tableau and then become loyal to the product. And on the bottom, I've tracked his mood and created fake quotes that he would be talking about throughout the process, from where he wants to be optimistic about Tableau as a potential tool instead of having to sit and do Excel all the time, to actually using Tableau as the tool and realizing how awesome and easy it is to create visualizations and how easy it is to refresh the data source. And so whenever you're building an interface that is substantial, anticipating this series of steps, whether it is awareness of the tool or actually a section of your dashboard, creating a journey map in order to articulate each of these points and determine where the mood is for the person, is going to help you figure out where the dips in the mood are. As you can see, the consideration portion and the decision portion of this journey map has low moods. What type of interventions can I create to up those moods, to create happy mood the whole time? And when we go back to the Apple example with the iPhone being charged before the user even uses the iPhone, that could have been a section on the journey map that has a low mood. Oh, I have this amazing iPhone that I'm going to be using, but I can't use it yet. I'm so excited to use it, but I can't use it because it's not charged. They solved that by charging it. They probably built journey maps to understand that flow of user thoughts when they're handling their product. And then last but not least, we have card sorting. So here's an example of different ideas that you would have for a dashboard that helps record ticketing systems for an IT manager. And you have all these ideas that you created in your brainstorming session, but you want to see how your end users classify these ideas. And so in one participant, you might sit them down and they might say that ticketing daily KPI success rates are metrics, and IT staff profiles and client profiles are demographic information, and reviews are sentiment analysis and client reviews. So they created these ideas, and they grouped these ideas, and they created sections. Now you have a dashboard information architecture. You have all of your dashboard visualizations on metrics. You have some demographic information that you can put your IT staff profiles and client profiles, and then you have a section for your reviews. So without you even doing anything and interviewing your end users, you've created an information architecture for your dashboard that you don't have to. You might have had a concept about it before, but this will either reinforce or it will oppose the idea that you had in your head. And it's really important to interview different participants. In one case, maybe participant 2 will think that success rates are part of reviews and sentiment analysis were part of metrics. So to have a bunch of different participants in your interviewing schedule, you're able to kind of figure out what is the general consensus on what the information architecture should be. Should success rates be part of reviews? Did most people think that, or did most people think that success rates should be part of metrics? Maybe there's a part of that metadata that is a little ambiguous. Maybe you need to refine your ideas more in order to make it more concrete so that you have a more consistent interviewing schedule. And interviewing consistently and refining this is really important as well. If you do a card sorting again after you make it more specific, then maybe you'll have a more consistent output from your users. So you've done all that. You've conceptualized, you've ideated, and now you have to prototype your tool. The first idea that you can do for prototyping, which I've done in grad school, and I'll show you in a second, is paper prototyping. So you actually draw your dashboard on paper, and you use like Post-it notes for buttons, and you use like transparent wax paper for like notifications that might appear on top of the interface. And you test that out with users in a testing environment. You basically give them a bunch of different screens and you show them, they'll like pretend to press a button and it'll go from one screen to another. And you're able to rapidly change different elements because it's all paper. You can quickly draw another element and stick it on with a Post-it note and have the user say, is that better? And then they might say yes or no, and you can take the Post-it off. So it's really rapid prototyping in order to get the user to understand how certain basic functionality works and how basic layout works. Once you've done that, you can run a low fidelity prototype. You can use PowerPoint, Figma, Adobe Creative Suite. There's a prototyping tool called Balsamiq that you can use. There's Sketch. There's so many different drawing tools out there and design tools that you can use to create a low fidelity prototype. And basically that is just a simple structure of your interface that's not paper. It's like an electronic version that has a little more fidelity to it and has a little more information on it that might that might create more questions for the end user. And I have an example of that in a second. Then you want to transition from a low fidelity prototype to a high fidelity prototype where it's a lot closer to your end product. In fact, it's almost identical. And when you test this with the end user, they're expecting that the high fidelity prototype is going to be very, very similar to what you're building in Tableau. Which leads me to number 4, you want to implement the tool of your choice. Once you've tested all your prototypes, you can finally implement it in Tableau. So paper prototype, here's an example of a paper prototype that I built in grad school when I created an application that helped reduce the incidence of sexual assault and sexual violence in college environments. Basically, the idea is that you have a group of people that are tethered to a geolocated system. And if one person in the group travels too far away from this geo-fence tether, it'll send a message to the other users that that person has left. And there have been a lot of reports about people who would accidentally leave or be taken by someone who they don't want to be taken. And, that could lead to many different, bad adverse consequences. And so getting that just-in-time notification where someone has left your group might help you recover or find them quicker. And so we created a fake iPhone. As you can see, we cut out the home screen and we have little Post-it notes for buttons. And it's really, really, really rough. Like I drew all of these. I'm not really good at drawing anything, but it was a way for us to generate different screens really quickly. And when I tested this, you basically took different screens out from the phone and you could replace different screens and you can put, as you can see on the very right, there's like that wax paper that allows you to generate like a notification on top of your screen. So it's just an example of like a prototype on paper, which is really, really interesting. And I found it amazing when I started to generate more ideas for my app. You want to test this with your stakeholders. Make sure that, they sit down, deal with the paper prototype, you're recording everything that they do, you record any confusion that they have or positive information that they have, basically write everything down. Then you want to build a low fidelity prototype. I just whipped this up in Figma, kind of creates a general idea of what your dashboard is going to look like in its more high fidelity versions. So you have a title on the top left, you have filter controls on the left, you have your 3 KPIs and a chart that explains those KPIs. And you have some labels that tell you what filters do. And you would show this to your end user and you would have them, confirm whether this is good. You can have many different versions of this that you can create in an app like Figma, where you can interact with a certain button and it brings you to another screen, like an electronic version of a paper prototype. So just a little more fidelity than paper. You have it on electronic medium. You might have like an example of a chart, maybe not just a square with a label on it, but give the person a little more idea of what you're trying to build them. And then again, test this. Make sure you write everything down. Then you create a high fidelity prototype. This is just a proof of concept that I created a few months ago for a dashboard. I didn't test any user experience on it, but it's just an example of a higher fidelity version of something that you would create. And so here we have like an image background, and you have like the 3 metrics in the middle and a navigation bar on a navigation wheel on the right-hand side. And again, you would test this out with your end users and see if this is something that they would be interested in. And they would imagine that this high definition, a high fidelity prototype would be very similar to what is going to be in Tableau or whatever tool that you're using. And so again, test this with your stakeholders, make sure that they understand the different parts of your high fidelity prototype and it makes sense. So then I skipped part 4, actually making it in Tableau, but we all know, that's where we're all here. We all do stuff in Tableau. Make it in Tableau and test them as well. That's really important too. And so the takeaways from this part is that user experience is cyclical and it's layered. In order to ideate your designs, you got to perform user research and create these profiles for your user and journeys of the user in order to kind of generate that expected workflow and expected profile that you're trying to build for. And then once you finish ideating, you want to create your prototypes, and you can skip, you don't have to do a paper prototype. You don't have to do a low fidelity prototype. The more you refine your prototypes, the better your user experience is going to be. And I know everyone is coming from different jobs with different levels of bandwidth and different timelines. And so if you have the bandwidth for it, add some of that to your workflow and you'll get better at it each time. I remember the first time I created a paper prototype, it was hard. But then once we started to build more screens for it, we realized how rudimentary and rough it can be. And so I think that it would be really helpful to create. Someone just asked a question whether it's whether you can prototype in Tableau as well. The issue with Tableau is that you have to create all the calculations and create all of the actual inner workings of it, and which is really good. But if you create an experience that the user was not intending in the first place, if you didn't capture all of those functions as well, you wasted your time. And the really good thing about paper prototypes is that you have the bandwidth and you have the ability to constantly change how you want your design to be. You don't have to create your calculations. You can just assume that your calculations are, here's a calculation that does this, press this button and the calculation will execute. And if that's what they're interested in, then you can make the calculation. It always takes longer to redo your code and redo your final prototype than it is to do something on paper, especially when you're building an actual app. And maybe less in Tableau, but this principle still sort of apply. Okay, so finally, we are on heuristic evaluation. How can you use this method not only to prove your UX design skills, but create an iterative design skill set? So let's go over what heuristic evaluation is. And it's the process where experts use rule of thumb to measure the usability of user interfaces in independent walkthroughs and report issues. So here, if you don't have the bandwidth to do all of this user testing, at least you can do this heuristic evaluation. You can actually also do heuristic evaluation with your end users, but it's going to be your call on how much time you're going to have to teach them about this process. So Norman Nielsen, again, has 10 heuristics for usability. Here's a few of them. I'm going to go over the ones that I feel like is the most important and that I use at my current job. But all of these all of these heuristics are really important to maximize the usability of your product. First is visibility of system status. And the thing did not pop up. But there was a quote on the left that says something along the lines of users have to understand that they're being that they have to understand that the dashboard and the application that they have is telling them the progress of the information that they're being led to. The example is like a loading bar or a skeleton screen, and there aren't any skeleton screens that you can create. Like if you go on LinkedIn and the page is loading, or you go on Facebook and the page is loading, you'll see kind of like a general like gray outline of what is actually going to be loaded, but there's no information. People then will expect that there will be information loaded after that and want that feedback. So in Tableau, you want to make sure that your visualizations are intuitive as possible. And does the user understand every call to action in my dashboard? And are the goals of my dashboard being communicated clearly, so that when they're interacting with the information on the dashboard, are they expecting the information and loading times and everything to make sense? Okay, so the next one is match between system and real world. The design should speak the user's language. Use words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user rather than internal jargon. So this is really important, especially because we use an application and a system that uses particular jargon, and we're also data people, so we have data jargon as well. And so the first question I like to ask, I remember Chantilly always talks about this, but would grandma understand how to use the dashboard? Not only does she understand how to use the dashboard, but is the language in the dashboard able to be understood by someone who has no idea what data is and what Tableau jargon is? So when you talk about something like a parameter can mean anything, but in Tableau, it has a certain function. A set action, if no one knew what Tableau was, they would not understand what that is. So make sure that you understand your audience. So if your audience has a lot of experience in Tableau, you can use that language. But if you explain everything in layman's terms, then you're going to have the most accessibility for your dashboard. The next one is user control and freedom. Users often perform actions by mistake. They need a clearly marked emergency exit to leave the unwanted action without having to go through an extended process. This is really important towards websites, but you can also apply it towards Tableau as well. So does my dashboard have a reset functionality? Is there a way that you can clear your filters? Is there a way that you can easily educate the users to redo a step that they've done? So like if you have a complicated parameter action that does filtering down, more granular data, how do you educate them to get back to the lower level of granularity? And also, how error prone is your dashboard? If your dashboard has a bunch of information on it, they might make errors all the time. You have to make sure that you're onboarding the user effectively so that they go from one step to the other without having too many questions in their head. And again, decision fatigue can create errors. You don't want to read through the information, so you just try to play around with it and you create an error. And if there's no way to recover from that, the user is going to give up your tool pretty quickly. Number 4, consistency and standards. Users should not have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. Follow platform and industry conventions. And so the first thing that comes to mind here is using color for different purposes within your dashboard. If you have a yellow color that signifies something, you want to make sure that yellow color in your dashboard means the same thing, or else someone's going to understand that or to misinterpret that color. And so you also want to make sure that colors are accessible as well. And so creating information on your dashboard that makes it so that it's consistent and relatable across different industries and different dashboards that a user has seen. Remember, one of the laws talks about user recall based on other applications that they use. You want to make sure that there's some consistency there. That's going to reduce the amount of time it takes for them to encode and process the information that they're working with. But you also want to make sure that there's no misinterpretation. So are different functionalities explained correctly, explicitly, and then are they standardized? And you really want to make sure that if you change something that is similar, that has a certain state on one dashboard and it changes on another dashboard, that needs to be front and center so the user understands what's going on. Finally, if you know how other companies make similar dashboards or how similar dashboards that fit a certain function are, then you can kind of replicate that, and it's going to help your user experience because people are going to expect where certain things are and how certain things work. Then you have recognition rather than recall. Minimize the user's memory load by making elements, actions, and options visible. The user should not have to remember information from one part of the interface to another. So this is really important for iconography and descriptions of things that are going to be similar on each dashboard. And so how well are the call to actions portrayed to the user? So is it something that is consistently colored? Is it in the same spot? Are your call to actions something that is really easily interpretable? Like an apply filters button. You don't want to change all the apply filters button. You want to make sure that it's all in the same type of format. So the user expects that using an apply filters button does that purpose. Also, how many elements does the user have to remember? If you have too many elements on your dashboard, the user might you might force the user to recall a lot of the information instead of recognize it. But if you create recognizable iconography that's consistent throughout all the dashboards that you make, they might not have to recall it. They might say, hey, this plus sign means to expand this dashboard, and every dashboard that this person has created uses that function. So that's the difference. You know, if you create a standardized set of buttons or of visualization styles, the user is going to remember how to use them just by the way that they look. And that's something that I do a lot in my job. I keep the same consistent visual styles, and I also make it so that if you have a certain visualization, that it's going to have a functionality, you know, querying other visualizations if you click on it, etc., that is consistent in other dashboards that I've created. And then finally, do you onboard the user effectively enough to recognize elements instead of remembering? If you teach someone how to use a certain tool, make sure that that's effective and that you either repeat that onboarding throughout your dashboard, or just make it, you know, a point, you know, create like a overlay to explain how a dashboard is supposed to work. And then finally, the last one I want to talk about is aesthetic and minimalist design, which is kind of like the core value that I use in my visualizations. And the quote for this is, interfaces should not contain information which is irrelevant or rarely needed. Every extra unit of information in an interface competes with the relevant units of information and diminishes their relative visibility. And this is reminiscent of one of the earlier principles that we talked about that said that the number of elements that you have increases the complexity and the number of decisions that you make. And so how many charts in your dashboard are going to be used by the end user? You can also think about the Pareto principle that 80% of the functionality is only going to be used by 20% of your dashboard. So you really want to make sure that you nail that 20% as effectively as possible in order for you to get most of the functionality of your dashboard. Everything else, you want to make sure that whenever you build your dashboard, every single chart, every single button, every little element has been carefully thought about so that you're not creating anything extraneous. Every little addition that you add is going to be more confusing for the end user. And refining that experience and making sure that everything is laid out correctly will help that. But you don't want too many different graphs on your dashboard, or else the flow is going to be harmed. The user is going to be kind of intimidated by the number of things on that dashboard. And you can basically solve this pretty easily by having multiple dashboards that are labeled nicely and go with the flow of the user's experience, or create a long dashboard that only introduces a certain number of relevant information per viewing screen on the user's eyes. That's why I like to make a lot of long form visualizations, because as you scroll throughout the visualization, you're only looking at one or two things at a time. And so you're not being overwhelmed by information. And then the last question is the question at hand being answered as simply as possible for the end user. Make sure that the calculations that you're making are able to really calculate that behind the scenes. Don't have the user enter a bunch of different parameters in order to generate the outcome unless absolutely necessary. And make sure that there's like a simple like question that the user has and the dashboard is answering one or two questions. That's how I build it at my work, and it seems to be pretty effective. I know there's a lot more information, a lot more intricacies in other disciplines, in other types of jobs, but just consider that and make sure that, especially end users who don't know what Tableau is, or you're trying to do change management at your company, bringing Tableau into the forefront. Make sure that things are simple for your end users to digest, and they'll understand the power of Tableau and kind of become more acquainted to it. So these are all kind of the rule of thumbs. I didn't cover all of them, but the ones that I particularly use. When you do this heuristic analysis, you want to be patient and thorough and examine every design element when you're creating a dashboard and see if it follows this heuristic design rule of thumb and make it its own case study. And so there are actually plenty of templates online in order to accomplish this. This one I found on UX Planet. The link is below, and basically it has the evaluator, date, website, whatever you're working on, and then each of the heuristics, and you can rate each of the heuristics from 0 to 4 and find any issues and any recommendations. Again, this is something you can do yourself or you can give someone else to do for you. And it has the definitions and everything on there, so I feel like this is a really helpful tool. You can also just objectively look at your dashboard and see if it follows these rule of thumb yourself and play around with it. So finally, part 3 takeaways. Heuristic evaluation is the process of using rule of thumb design principles to refine and iterate your designs. Heuristic evaluation is a methodical process that involves patience and meticulosity to achieve. And that's really important. I feel like that if you have the bandwidth again to do this, it's going to be really helpful, but do as much as you can. It doesn't have to be a full heuristic evaluation. Maybe handle a couple of them in between your iterations, or at least get the cores that you think are important in order to maximize the usability of the tool that you're building. And then so that you don't have to worry about creating your own template, use templates that exist online. Some of them you have to pay for, but some of them you can just use yourself. I feel like that's okay to do. So that's pretty much all that I have to talk about. It's a lot of information. I recommend you go back on the recording once this is recorded and go through it. And if you have any questions, definitely let me know. Just to conclude, user experience is a cyclical and layered process that involves researching, prototyping, and evaluating your product. And you want to understand the basics, the basic fundamentals of user experience and visual design. That's going to help you do everything that's required for the user experience stack. And that does take some practice. But practicing the actual methodologies is going to be the important part. And so I encourage all of you who are listening to research a little more about the ideas and steps that I listed. There's, for each of the sections on prototyping and ideation, you can have an entire presentation on that stuff. I just wanted to make you all aware of what exists out there. And if you include this stuff at your work, if you have the ability to do it, it's really going to pay off because you're methodically creating an experience that usually you kind of do behind the scenes. And if you quantify all of it, you're going to be able to iterate on your designs much more effectively because you'll know each pinpoint of what is good and what is bad with the dashboards that you're creating. So again, thank you all and good luck. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'd be happy to answer them, but definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm happy to give one-on-one Zoom sessions with anyone who's more interested in learning about the intricacies of everything. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Hey, thank you, David, and thank you for sharing the journey of an analyst for UX, right? So much of enriching information and knowledge for everyone. Just one request from everyone. Will you share this presentation or they can reach out to you if they want to learn more about it?
Yeah, I think I used a certain, I think I can provide the link to people. I might password it and I can give anyone the password of the presentation and they can look at it.
Sure. So if you want access to the presentation, just reach out to David and I will be happy to do that. So David, one question I have, and this is more related to your journey in terms of Tableau, right? What was the impact of Tableau community to the whole process of UX you mentioned today, right? I think one thing you mentioned was feedback over here, right? You have reached out to people in the community for feedback on whatever ways you have created. So what has been your journey in terms of Tableau community, if you want to share with everyone?
Yeah, so I started in the Tableau community after the Tableau conference. I think it was Tableau Conference 19, the last one that we had in person. And it was really galvanizing to hear the type of community that Tableau had. And so I started to include my presence online and do Makeover Monday and other little initiatives like that. And as I built these dashboards, there was like this whole feedback cycle that people would message me on the side and say, here are some of the things that I recommend you do. Are you open to feedbacks? Stuff like that. And so I've had experience in my graduate school learning about user experience, and I wanted to kind of give back to the community in many different ways, either through my visualizations or through things like this where I talk about it. And I feel like it's something that we are so ingrained it's so ingrained in our psychology, yet as analysts, we don't always have the bandwidth to do it. And I kind of made sure to make a point of that in this presentation. But how important it is to kind of include some part of this in your workflow in order to make sure that the dashboards are going to be good for your work and good for the community. And I think I see so many people make really outstanding dashboards and visualizations on Tableau Public. I think it's kind of a hats off to that, but to also point out to people who might not understand what makes a dashboard look really nice or what makes a dashboard really easy to use, there is some way of methodically creating that experience for you. And so I feel like my journey is something that was built through my graduate education and dealing and talking with people within the community and actually using Makeover Monday as case studies for this. When I sit down and do a Makeover Monday challenge, I'll think to myself, how can I visually improve the user experience of this visualization? And so trying to figure out how to manipulate the data so you're optimizing it. How do you tell a story through the data and through the visualizations that you're using? And how do you immerse the end user in a certain brand or a certain experience that you want them to be immersed in? And I feel like that's really important. You want to make the end user feel something, not just look at your visualization. And there are a few examples that I've tried to create that effect in some of the visualizations that I've created.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for sharing the journey. Just a shout out from Jim Denver, and he's saying that was a great presentation today.
Thank you, Jim.
Perfect. I think thank you, David, for presenting today. It is an honor for everyone in VizConnect to hear you right in terms of UX and what exactly we can learn to go back to our Tableau dashboard and implement over there. So thank you for that.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you.
Perfect. And with that, thank you everyone for joining. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.